Have you ever thought about engaging in a public debate with Slavoj Zizek? He has many interesting observations on the topic of ideology, and that would be a good conversation. Yes.
Hello, Zero Books readers. It's me, Douglas Lane. In this video, I'll try to provide a conceptual guide for the upcoming debate between Jordan Peterson and Slavoj Zizek. I'll explain Zizek and Peterson's ideas on happiness, critique Peterson's understanding of capitalism and Zizek's understanding of Marxism, and take a quote from Ron Roberts' book, Psychology and Capitalism, in order to find the key point of agreement between these two intellectuals. When I invited Jordan Peterson on the Zero Books podcast back in December of 2017, I received some criticism from members of what I'll call the Facebook left. People worried that by having Peterson on my program, I would risk legitimizing him, even as the New York Times was running opinion pieces praising Peterson as the most important intellectual alive today. I would have taken these concerns as profound compliments if I'd thought that the people who made them really believed that my podcast would legitimize Peterson. But what people really believed was that any representative of the radical left was more legitimate than Peterson, and that by deigning to talk to or debate him, I was risking the reputation and definition of the left itself. But now that Zizek has agreed to debate Peterson, he's receiving similar, if not exactly the same, criticism. At this point, Zizek has already been mostly canceled. But for those who are a bit less woke, the concern is that Zizek will lose. The worry is that Zizek will too readily agree with Peterson on some key issues, and will be too abstruse to clearly explain points of disagreement. And some have decided that, given Zizek and Peterson's deficiencies, the debate will ultimately turn out to be a waste of time.
You see, the problem you are having with postmodernism is its conflation with neo-Marxism
at the behest of its liberating factors, liberating from societal structures such as hierarchical structuralism, consumerism, capitalism, etc., and so forth and so on.
You cannot deny postmodernism's relegation of language to a means only for grabbing arbitrary power because the radical belief in any objective truth claim.
I think that rather than writing off this debate, we should try instead to prepare for it. Rather than worry about the optics of Zizek and Peterson possibly agreeing, we should instead try to clarify their ideas in advance so that we won't miss the truth of their disagreement. The best way to understand this disagreement is to look at how the debate is framed and then to take that frame apart. So the title of their event is Happiness: Capitalism versus Marxism. So let's start with that. Let's start with happiness. To what extent do Peterson and Žižek agree about happiness?
So again, what is wrong with happiness? I claim, to put it at most elementary terms, that happiness relies on the subject's inability or unreadiness to fully confront the consequences of his or their desire. The price of happiness is that the subject remains stuck in the inconsistency of its desire. What do I mean by this? In our daily lives, we pretend to desire things which we do not really desire, so that ultimately the worst thing that can happen to us is to get what we officially desire.
A very minor word. People who are always pushing happiness as the key measure for successful existence. It's so ill-informed that it's embarrassing that even happens. Positive emotion makes people impulsive. Maniacs, for example, which is really, that's mania, right? Bipolar disorder. If you're manic, you're one happy person. Way too happy. Everything is great. Nothing but wonderful things that are beyond your imagination are going to happen to you, and they're going to happen fast. And so you're down to the mall to buy everything you can possibly get your hands on because you have 100 uses for everything. And then a week later, you crash into your depressive episode and you realize that you're $150,000 in debt and you've alienated everyone that you know. It's like, that's untrammeled positive emotion. So how about no?
Now, they might appear to agree about happiness. Neither think that the pursuit of happiness is a correct basis for a meaningful life. However, their reasons for rejecting the idea of happiness are absolutely opposite. Žižek believes that the difficulty with happiness is that it entails giving up on desire. Most of the time, according to Žižek, we're happy when we can dream about getting things that we don't really want. For example, we might have a mistress and a wife, and we might dream about leaving the wife for the mistress. But what we will find if we do so is that the mistress is no longer what we want when she is outside the frame of that marriage. We want the mistress, not in herself, but as a fantasy that supports a marriage that we also don't want. For Žižek, then, happiness is an ideological category. It is what you achieve when you conform to or accept a deadlock. For Peterson, on the other hand, happiness is the same thing as desire. Happiness and pleasure are basically equal, which means that happiness must be put off, mediated, moderated, precisely so that it doesn't lead you to be unbalanced. Peterson rejects happiness because it has the potential to disrupt the ordered, traditional life that defines Western civilization. What about capitalism? Well, again, there might seem to be points of agreement between the two of them here.
Capitalism. The problem is not there are evil people here and there. The problem is the basic logic of the system as it was developed by Zygmunt Bauman and many others. Some people even claim that if you look in a non-humanitarian way, just as at the pure logic of today's global capitalism, you arrive at a ratio, even some people claim, of 20 to 80%. That is to say, again, if you disregard all humanitarian problems and just look at what would have been ideal for the functioning of the system, basically the idea is that sooner or later 80% of the people are disposable, of no use.
One of the things that you'll find if you look at creative production in any domain, it doesn't matter, artistic domain, food production, novels written, novels sold, money generated, number of companies generated, number of goals scored in hockey, etc. Number of paintings painted, number of compositions written, anything like that, where the fundamental underlying measure is human productivity, what you find is that a very tiny percentage of people produce almost all the output. It's called a Pareto distribution, P-A-R-E-T-O, and it was studied in detail in scientific productivity by someone named De Sola Price. It's a square root law, so here's the law fundamentally. If you look at the number of people who are in a given domain, who are producing in a given domain, the square root of the people produce half the product. So that means if you have 10 employees, 3 of them do half the work, but if you have 10,000 employees, 100 of them do half the work. Right, it's a very, very vicious statistic. And you won't learn about that in psychology for reasons I have no idea about, because you learn about the normal distribution and not the Pareto distribution. But Pareto distributions govern, for example, the distribution of money, which is why 1% of the people in the general population have the overwhelming amount of money, and 1/10 of that 1% has almost all of that, right? So I think it's like the richest 100 people in the world have as much money as the bottom 2.5 billion. And you think, well, that's a terrible thing, and perhaps it is, but what you have to understand is that that law governs the distribution of creative production across all creative domains, right? It's something like a natural law.
While they agree that under capitalism, something like 80% of people are unproductive, uncreative, and basically left behind, Žižek would use this fact to justify investigating the possibility for changing the system. For Žižek, this fact is reason enough to be concerned about the future of the capitalist order itself. For Peterson, on the other hand, this 20-80 split is a law of nature. Capitalism, according to Peterson, isn't responsible for the inequality that Žižek is concerned about, but rather this inequality is built into nature itself. What about Marxism? Peterson believes that Marxism is Stalinism. It is a system wherein an authoritarian state tries to control people in order to create true equality. But this means suppressing people and getting in the way of the 20% that produce everything we need in the world, according to Peterson. Marxism leads to starvation, it leads to the gulag, it leads to death. Zizek believes that Marx was basically a half-wrong Hegelian, and that the task for the left today is not to return to Marx, but to return to Hegel, and maybe to Lenin. Now, if you want to hear my response to Peterson's understanding of Marxism, you can find the link to a video I made in response to him about a year ago or more, maybe about a year and 6 months ago. It'll be in this card. And you should also take a look for a future video wherein I'll tackle Zizek's understanding of Marx as well. We've taken a look at how Peterson and Žižek both agree and disagree about happiness, about capitalism, and about Marxism. But there's one remaining topic to cover, and the best way to approach that topic is through Ron Roberts' book, Psychology and Capitalism. In his book, Roberts claims that psychology is a product of capitalist ideology, which would mean that since both Peterson and Žižek are interested in psychoanalytical psychology, Peterson and Žižek themselves can't really escape the ideologies they want to critique. In his book, Roberts writes, Christianity and the Protestant Reformation in particular have paved the way for a form of individualism to develop that has been at the center of the project of psychology. For Peterson and Žižek both, the human individual is at the center of society, whereas for Marx, the human individual has really yet to arrive. For Marx, the world isn't directed or primarily shaped by the ideas in our heads, but rather we have created an objective and or alienated system of material relations that does our thinking for us. The goal for Marx is to arrive at a point wherein we can understand the consequences of our own material practices, recognize how our ideas are put into action, and seize hold of and transform our own productive practices. For Žižek, on the other hand, our social life is best conceived of in ideological terms, and while he has a much more simplistic or one-sided conception of society, Peterson fundamentally agrees.
Modern people are fundamentally materialistic. And there's some utility in that. We're masters of material transformation. And the fact that we're materialist in our scientific philosophies has made us extremely powerful, maybe too powerful for our morality, extremely powerful from a technological perspective, but it's blinded us to certain things. And I think one of the things that it's really blinded us to is the nature of our own being. Because we make the assumption that the fundamental constituent elements of reality are material, we fail to notice that the fundamental constituent elements of our own reality are not material. They're emotional, they're motivational, they're dreams, they're visions, they're relationships with other people. They're conscious, they're dependent on consciousness and self-consciousness. And we have absolutely no materialist explanation whatsoever, either for consciousness or self-consciousness.
This emphasis on the immaterial or the abstract leads both Žižek and Peterson to embrace Christianity, but their conception of Christianity is fundamentally different. For Žižek, the easiest way to understand Christ is through the book of Job and through understanding Job's suffering. You might recall that story, but in case you're unfamiliar with it, here's Jordan Peterson to explain it to you.
God and the devil have a bet, which seems a little, on the unreasonable side for God, but he gets to do whatever he wants. So he has a bet with Satan, roughly speaking, and he says, well, Job, he tells Satan that Job is a good guy and that he's faithful to God. And Satan says, yeah, let me at him for a while. I bet you we can do something about that. And God says, roughly speaking, no, you can torture him all you want. He's going to stay faithful. And Satan says, well, we'll have a bet on that. And so God hands him over. And what happens to Job? It's like everything terrible that you can imagine then happens to Job, right? all his family dies, all his possessions are destroyed, he gets a horrible skin disease, and so then he's sitting there by the fire sort of scraping himself with bits of broken pots, and all his friends come around and tell him that the reason all this happened to him was because he deserved it.
If I were to go on playing this clip, what you might notice is how Peterson leaves Job behind and becomes fixated on God's justification for his behavior. Peterson explains how God is the force that can bring order out of chaos. He reads at length from various sections of the Bible in order to weave an explanation of the mythic significance of God's own explanation of his behavior to Job. For Peterson, God's explanation seems to hold, or the question of whether God's explanation holds is at the very least put aside. The most important lesson to learn from the book of Job, apparently, is that the Bible justifies
the spirit that generates the culture should be superordinate to the spirit of the culture. It's something like that. And that's also why I think that one of the brilliant discoveries, let's say, of Western individualistic civilization is that the group is there to serve the individual because the individual is the thing that revivifies the group. So each depend on the other integrally. But if you subordinate the individual to the group, then the group stagnates and dies. And so that's a very bad long-term strategy, even though the group and belonging to the group is clearly necessary. You need to uphold the values of the group, but the values of the group should be subordinated to producing the individual who gives the group vision.
For Žižek, the point of the book of Job is entirely different. Turning to the Christian apologist G.K. Chesterton and his interpretation of the book of Job, Žižek points out that rather than God explaining and justifying his behavior, God presents Job with the depth of his own, that is God's, inexplicability. For Žižek, the book of Job illustrates that understanding the division between what we can rationally comprehend and the world as it truly is, the impossibility of ever fully grasping the world, is itself an understanding of the world. What the book of Job demonstrates is that not only understanding, but the world, even God himself, is partial, is a mystery, even to itself or to himself. For Žižek, Christianity is a religion that aims at freedom, a religion that can only be fully understood through atheism. Whereas for Peterson, Christianity is a sacred myth that must be believed despite or against the atheism that is born out of our finitude. I would say that of the two of them, Žižek is the better Christian. Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.